Dr. Thomas Anderson stared at his computer screen, his coffee growing cold beside his keyboard. It was past midnight at the University of Michigan's cryptozoology department, but he couldn't look away from the satellite images before him. Something wasn't right about the heat signatures in the Congo River basin. "Emily," he called out, forgetting it was well past normal working hours. To his surprise, his research assistant's head popped around the doorframe. "You're still here." Emily Parker pushed her glasses up her nose, clutching her own coffee cup. Her blonde hair was messy from running her hands through it too many times, a habit she had when deep in research. "Come look at this," Thomas said, waving her over. "These thermal images from the Congo, they don't match any known species patterns." Emily leaned over his shoulder, her tired eyes suddenly widening. The thermal imaging showed a massive heat signature moving through the water, bigger than any known river creature in the region. It was nearly 40 feet long. "Could it be a group of hippos clustered together?" she asked, but her voice wavered with doubt. Thomas shook his head. "The movement pattern is all wrong. Look at how it moves. It's one creature, and it's got a long neck." He pulled up another window on his computer, showing centuries-old sketches from Belgian colonists. "Remember these?" Emily nodded. The drawings showed a creature that looked remarkably like a small sauropod dinosaur, with a long neck and tail. The locals had called it Mokele-Mbembe. For years, it had been dismissed as just another legend, like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. "But that's impossible," Emily said, sitting down heavily in the chair next to Thomas. "Dinosaurs have been extinct for millions of years." "The coelacanth was thought to be extinct too," Thomas reminded her, referring to the prehistoric fish discovered alive in 1938. "The Congo Basin has areas that haven't changed much since the Cretaceous period. We've barely scratched the surface of what lives in those waters." Thomas pulled up more satellite data, showing the same heat signature appearing in different locations over the past month. Each sighting followed the river's deepest channels, always moving in a pattern that suggested intelligence rather than random wandering. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a particular cluster of readings. "It's not just random movements. These creatures, if there's more than one, are following specific paths. They're avoiding the heavily trafficked areas of the river, staying in the deepest parts where boats can't follow." Emily was already pulling up historical documents on her tablet. "There's something else," she said, her voice excited. "I've been translating some colonial-era documents from the Belgian archives. In 1907, a Belgian surveyor reported seeing something unusual in the river. He described it as moving like a living subway car through the water, with a neck like a living crane." Thomas felt his heart rate quicken. What else? The locals wouldn't help them search for it. They said disturbing the Mokele-Mbembe would bring disaster. But here's the interesting part. They described its behavior exactly like what we're seeing in these heat signatures. They said it follows the deep channels and only surfaces in certain areas, usually at dawn or dusk. Thomas stood up and walked to the wall map of the Congo Basin. Red pins marked every reported sighting of the Mokele-Mbembe over the past century. Blue pins showed where their heat signatures had appeared. The pattern was undeniable. They matched perfectly. "Emily," he said slowly, "I think we might have just found something that's going to rewrite our understanding of survival and extinction." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "But we need to be absolutely certain before we go public. We need to see it for ourselves." Emily was already typing on her laptop. "I'll start putting together a proposal for an expedition. We'll need funding, equipment, permits." She looked up at him with a grin. "And a team. We can't do this alone." Thomas nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and anxiety. If they were right, this would be the scientific discovery of the century. If they were wrong, their careers would be over. But as he looked back at the thermal images on his screen, showing that massive, graceful shape moving through the ancient waters of the Congo, he knew they had no choice. They had to know the truth about what was living in those rivers. "Send out the emails tonight," He told Emily, "We're going to need the best team we can get. This isn't just about finding a new species anymore. This could be about discovering living history." 2 weeks after their late-night discovery, Thomas sat in his office, reviewing applications from people who wanted to join the expedition. Emily had spread the word carefully, making sure to keep the true purpose of their mission secret. They had called it a comprehensive river ecosystem study. "What about this one?" Emily placed a file in front of Thomas. Jack Reynolds, former Navy SEAL, now a wildlife photographer for National Geographic. He spent the last 5 years photographing dangerous animals in their natural habitats. Thomas opened the file, studying the photo of a strong-faced man in his late 30s. "Perfect. We need someone who can handle himself in tough situations. What's his response to dangerous wildlife?" "He has a strict no-kill policy unless human life is in immediate danger," Emily said. "He once spent 6 hours in a tree waiting for an angry elephant to calm down rather than use his rifle." "Call him," Thomas decided. "We need that kind of patience." The office door opened, and a tall woman walked in, carrying a stack of fossil photographs. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, her voice carrying a hint of excitement. "Dr. Lisa Miller." Thomas stood up to greet her. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Lisa was the country's leading expert in paleontology, specifically focusing on sauropod dinosaurs. Her recent paper on their possible survival patterns had caught Thomas's attention. "When I saw your thermal imaging data, I canceled my other appointments," Lisa said, spreading her photos on the desk. "Look at these fossils we found last year in Tanzania. The bone structure suggests some sauropods might have adapted to semi-aquatic life before the extinction event." Thomas watched as Emily leaned in, her eyes wide. "So it's possible." "Possible." Lisa smiled. "It's more than possible. Those deep river channels in the Congo have remained virtually unchanged for millions of years. If any large species found a way to survive there, they would have had everything they needed." A knock on the door interrupted them. A weathered-looking man with gray hair stepped in, followed by a younger woman carrying what looked like drone equipment. "Bob Wilson and Marie Thompson, right on time," Emily said, making introductions. Bob had spent 20 years as a guide in the Congo Basin. His knowledge of the river systems was unmatched, and more importantly, he had connections with the local tribes. "The area you're interested in," Bob said, his voice rough from years of outdoor work, "it's tricky. The water channels can change overnight, but I know people in every village along that stretch. They trust me." Marie set down her equipment carefully. "And I can help us see what's below the surface," she said, patting her custom-built drone case. "These babies can map underwater terrain and track large heat signatures better than anything on the market." Thomas looked around at the group gathered in his office. Each person brought something essential to their mission. Jack's protective skills, Lisa's scientific knowledge, Bob's experience with the land and its people, Marie's technical expertise, and Emily's sharp analytical mind. "There's something you all need to know," Thomas said, standing up. He turned on his projector, showing the thermal images that had started everything. "This isn't just about studying river ecosystems." For the next hour, he and Emily laid out their evidence. The heat signatures, the historical documents, the local legends, and the matching patterns that suggested something extraordinary was living in the Congo River. When they finished, the room was quiet. Bob was the first to speak. "I've heard stories," he said slowly. "Things the locals have seen. Things they've warned me about. I always thought they were just legends, but now, if we're right about this," Lisa added, "it will change everything we know about extinction and survival." Marie was already pulling up satellite maps on her tablet. "The water depth in these channels would be perfect for a large aquatic species. My drones can scan every inch." Jack nodded, his expression serious. "And I can document everything without disturbing the wildlife. But we need to move fast. The dry season is coming, and those channels will be harder to navigate." Thomas looked at Emily, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Then it's settled," he said. "We leave for the Congo in 2 weeks. Whatever's living in those rivers has stayed hidden for millions of years. We might be the first scientists to prove it exists." As the team began discussing logistics, Thomas felt a mix of excitement and fear. They were about to embark on something that could either make history or ruin their careers. But looking at the determined faces around him, he knew they had the right people for this impossible task. The morning sun rose over Lake Tail, turning the water's surface into sheets of gold. 2 weeks had passed since the team set up their base camp on the lake's eastern shore. Marie sat in her monitoring station, a converted shipping container filled with screens showing feeds from her underwater drones. "Anything on the sensors?" Thomas asked, bringing her a cup of coffee. "Nothing yet," Marie said, but then paused. "Wait." She leaned closer to one of her screens. "Look at this heat signature." Thomas nearly spilled his coffee. On the screen, a massive shape moved through the deep water channel. It was bigger than anything they'd seen before. "Get the others," he said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. Now, within minutes, the whole team crowded into the monitoring station. Jack had his cameras ready, and Lisa clutched her tablet, taking notes rapidly. "It's following the same pattern we saw in the satellite images," Emily pointed out, tracing the creature's path on the main screen. Bob shook his head in wonder. "In 20 years on these rivers, I've never seen anything like this." Suddenly, a new voice joined them. "But my people have." Everyone turned to see Michael Brooks, a local man who had joined their team as a guide alongside Bob. Michael's grandfather had been a tribal elder, and he knew all the old stories. "The old ones speak of it moving just like this," Michael said, pointing to the heat signature. "They say it comes up for air when the sun touches the water, but only in the deep pools." Marie's hands flew over her controls. "If that's true, then based on its current path," she pulled up a map. "It's heading for the deep pool near the bend. We could get a visual." "Pack up," Thomas decided. "Quick and quiet. Jack, get your cameras. Lisa, bring the sampling gear. We might only get one chance at this." 20 minutes later, they were in position around the deep pool. Jack sat in a camouflaged blind with his cameras, while Marie's drones hovered silently overhead. The rest of the team waited in the brush, barely breathing. The water's surface broke. At first, it looked like a smooth, dark log rising from the depths. Then it kept rising and rising. A neck, thick as a tree trunk and covered in scales that shone like wet stones, lifted into the air. The head was unlike anything they'd ever seen. Not quite a snake, not quite a lizard, but something in between. Lisa's tablet clattered to the ground. "It's impossible," she whispered. "The neck structure, it's just like the fossils." But alive," Emily finished, her voice filled with awe. The creature's head turned slowly, surveying the shore. Its eyes were large and dark, showing an intelligence that sent shivers down their spines. Jack's camera clicked rapidly but silently. Then Michael stepped forward, moving slowly and carefully. To everyone's shock, he began to hum a low rhythmic tune. The creature's head swung toward him, but it didn't retreat. If anything, it seemed curious. "My grandfather's song," Michael explained softly. "He said our people have sung to them for generations. They remember." For several minutes, the creature remained still, listening to Michael's song. Then, with a grace that seemed impossible for its size, it slipped back beneath the water's surface, leaving barely a ripple. The team sat in stunned silence until Marie's voice came through their earpieces. "You need to see this," she said urgently. The drones picked up something else. "There's an underwater cave system beneath us. And," she paused, "I'm tracking 3 more heat signatures of the same size." Thomas looked at his team's faces, seeing his own mix of fear and excitement reflected back. They had just proven that a creature science said was impossible had survived here for millions of years. But they were also now responsible for one of the greatest discoveries in history. and its protection. Well, Bob said, breaking the silence, I guess the legends were true all along. Lisa was already reviewing Jack's photos. This changes everything we thought we knew about extinction and survival. But she looked up at Thomas. What do we do now? Now, Thomas said, watching the water where the creature had vanished. We make sure they stay safe. This isn't just our discovery, it's our responsibility. As if in response, a deep sound rumbled through the water, like distant thunder. The Mokele-Mbembe was letting them know it was still there, watching and waiting to see what these strange humans would do next. 3 days after their first sighting, the team pushed deeper into uncharted territory. Bob led them along narrow paths that barely existed, while Jack kept watch for dangerous wildlife. The jungle was alive with sounds, but everyone remained focused on their goal, finding the underwater cave system Marie's drones had detected. Stop, Jack said suddenly, holding up his hand. The team froze in their tracks. Ahead of them, a massive python slid across their path. Jack waited patiently until it disappeared into the undergrowth before signaling them forward. That's why we brought you, Thomas said, patting Jack on the shoulder. Emily would have walked right into it. Emily rolled her eyes but smiled. She was too busy looking at Marie's tablet, where a map showed the underwater cave network they were tracking. According to these readings, the main entrance should be just ahead. The team emerged from the dense jungle onto a wide riverbank. The water here was dark and deep, with smooth rocks lining the shore. Lisa crouched down to examine some unusual marks on one of the rocks. Look at these, she called out. These aren't from any known river animal. The spacing and depth suggest something huge pulled itself onto the bank. Bob walked over and studied the marks. Fresh too. Can't be more than a few hours old. Michael touched the marks gently. The old stories say they sometimes come onto land to eat the softer plants that grow near the water. Marie's drone buzzed quietly overhead, its cameras scanning the area. I got movement, she said through their radio earpieces. Something big just entered the cave system about half a mile downstream. Thomas looked at his team. They were all tired and covered in mud, but their eyes were bright with excitement. We need to set up observation posts. Jack, find us some good hiding spots with clear views of the water. Jack moved quickly, setting up 3 camouflaged blinds at different points along the bank. The team split into groups. Thomas and Emily in one blind, Lisa and Marie in another, while Jack, Bob, and Michael took the third. Hours passed slowly. The sun climbed high overhead, making the air thick and heavy. Emily was about to suggest they take a break when the water began to move. There, Thomas whispered, pointing at a ripple pattern that didn't match the river's flow. Through their radios, they heard Marie's excited whisper. The drones are picking up 2 separate heat signatures. They're huge. The water churned, and suddenly, 2 long necks broke the surface. The creatures were even larger than the one they'd seen before. They moved with surprising grace, their scales glistening in the sunlight as they reached up to feed on the high branches of trees near the water. They're a mated pair. Lisa's voice came through softly on the radio. Look at their behavior. It's just like the feeding patterns we see in the fossil record of sauropod dinosaurs. Jack's camera clicked quietly, capturing every moment. But then something went wrong. A branch snapped loudly under someone's foot. The creatures' heads whipped around toward the sound. In an instant, they dove beneath the surface, their powerful tails creating waves that rocked the shoreline. Follow them, Thomas called out. The team scrambled to their feet, running along the bank as Marie's drones tracked the creatures' heat signatures underwater. They're heading for the cave entrance, Marie reported, her fingers flying over her tablet's controls. Wait, there's something else. The cave system. It's massive. It looks like it connects to a whole network of underwater chambers. The team reached a point where the river widened into a deep pool. The water here was incredibly clear, and they could see the dark mouth of the underwater cave below. This is it, Bob said, checking his equipment. This is where all the local legends say they disappear to. Thomas looked at his team. What had started as a scientific expedition had turned into something much bigger. They weren't just observing these creatures anymore. They were on the verge of discovering their home. "We need to go down there," he said finally. "We need to see where they live." Jack nodded, already pulling out their diving gear. "I'll go first, check for hazards. But remember, we're in their world now. We play by their rules." As the team prepared for their most dangerous dive yet, the water below them stirred with movement. The Mokele-Mbembe were down there, in their hidden world, and they were about to share their ancient secrets with these determined humans. The underwater cave glowed with the soft blue light from their diving lamps. Jack led the way, with Thomas and Lisa close behind. They had been underwater for 15 minutes, following a massive tunnel that seemed to have been carved out by centuries of water flow. Lisa pointed to the cave walls. Even through the diving mask, her eyes were wide with excitement. The walls were smooth, but covered with regular grooves, marks that could only have been made by something very large repeatedly passing through. Thomas signaled to the others and directed his light upward. The tunnel was opening into a larger chamber. As they swam higher, their lights revealed something extraordinary. Their radios crackled with Emily's voice from the surface station. "What are you seeing down there?" "The drone feeds are showing a massive cavity." "You wouldn't believe it," Thomas replied, his voice filled with awe. It's a nesting site." The chamber was enormous, with several air pockets near the top where the creatures could surface to breathe. But what caught everyone's attention were the massive depressions in the sandy floor. Nests, each one perfectly shaped and lined with plant material. Lisa swam to one of the nests and carefully took samples of the plant matter. She placed them in sealed containers, her hands shaking with excitement despite her years of scientific training. Jack suddenly tapped his light against his tank 3 times, their warning signal. In the distance, something large was moving toward them. "Back to the tunnel entrance," he signaled. The team quickly but calmly retreated to a hidden observation point they had passed earlier. From their hiding spot, they watched as one of the creatures they'd seen earlier entered the chamber. It moved with surprising grace, its long neck swaying as it checked each nest. Then it did something remarkable. It began rearranging the plant material in one of the nests, using its mouth with careful precision. "It's showing tool use," Lisa whispered into her radio. "This is incredible. They're not just surviving. They're maintaining complex nesting behaviors that we've only theorized about from fossil records." After the creature left, the team continued their exploration. In a smaller side chamber, they found what made Lisa nearly drop her sample kit, a section of wall that was different from the rest. "Those are fossils," she said, her voice trembling. "But not just any fossils. These are from the late Cretaceous period. This cave system has been here since the time of the dinosaurs." Thomas swam closer to examine the wall. "The creatures must have found these caves during the extinction event," he said. "They've been using them ever since." Their lights caught something in the sand below the fossil wall. Jack swam down and carefully brushed away years of sediment, revealing a shed scale bigger than his hand. "Taking samples," Lisa said, carefully collecting the scale. "If we can get DNA from this." Their radios suddenly crackled with Marie's urgent voice from above. "You need to surface soon. Your air is getting low. And there's something else. The drones are picking up multiple large heat signatures moving in your direction." As if to confirm her warning, a deep rumble echoed through the cave. The water around them vibrated with the sound. "They're coming back," Thomas said. "We need to leave. We have enough samples for now." The team carefully made their way back through the tunnel. Behind them, the rumbling grew louder. Just as they reached the cave entrance, their lights caught a glimpse of something massive moving in the darkness, multiple somethings. They broke the surface near the riverbank where Emily, Marie, Bob, and Michael waited anxiously. As they climbed out of the water, Lisa was already examining the scale they'd found. "This changes everything," she said, her voice filled with wonder. These creatures, they're not just survivors. They're the direct descendants of the dinosaurs we've been studying as fossils. They'd been down there this whole time, adapting, evolving, surviving. Thomas looked at the water, which had grown still again. We've just rewritten the history of evolution, he said. But our biggest challenge isn't finding them anymore. It's protecting them, Emily finished, understanding in her eyes. Because once the world knows they're here, the team shared worried looks. They had made the discovery of the century, but with it came a responsibility they were only beginning to understand. Back at their base camp, Lisa hadn't slept for 24 hours. She sat surrounded by sample containers and testing equipment, her eyes fixed on a microscope. The scale they had found in the underwater cave was unlike anything she had ever seen before. The DNA results are back, she announced as Thomas and Emily rushed into the lab tent. You're not going to believe this. She handed them a tablet showing 2 DNA sequences side by side. The one on the left is from a sauropod fossil. The right is from our scale sample. The match is over 80%. That's impossible, Emily whispered, but she was looking at the proof right in front of her. Mary burst into the tent, almost knocking over a stack of equipment. Sorry, she said, catching her breath, but you all need to see this now. They followed her to the monitoring station, where her advanced sonar equipment was set up. On the main screen, a complex 3D map showed the underwater cave system they had discovered. But now it was different. Dozens of large heat signatures moved through the tunnels. I've been mapping the whole system, Marie explained, her fingers flying over the keyboard. It's not just a few creatures. Look at this. The map zoomed out, revealing that the cave system stretched for miles under the jungle. Different chambers lit up with heat signatures, showing movement patterns that looked almost like underwater roads or highways. It's a whole civilization, Bob said from the doorway, where he and Michael had joined them. They've built their own world down there. Michael nodded slowly. Our stories speak of their cities beneath the water, but no one believed them. Jack came in from his latest photography run, his camera in hand. You need to see these two, he said, connecting his camera to a display screen. The images showed clear shots of different creatures, some larger, some smaller, some with slightly different scale patterns or neck lengths. They've evolved, Lisa said, studying the images. Just like any other species, they've developed variations. These aren't just survivors, they're thriving. Thomas was about to respond when a loud beeping came from Marie's equipment. New movement, she said, pulling up a live feed. They're using sonar to communicate. Listen. She switched on the speakers, and the room filled with deep, complex sounds. The patterns repeated in what seemed like specific sequences. It's a language, Emily realized. They're not just making random noises, they're talking to each other. Look at this, Marie said, pointing to another screen. Her drones had captured footage of 2 younger creatures being guided by a larger one through what looked like an underwater obstacle course. They're teaching their young. They have a social structure. They learn. They adapt. Thomas sat down heavily in a chair. We're not just dealing with a few surviving ancient creatures, he said. We've discovered an entire species that's been living and evolving right under our noses for millions of years. And they're intelligent, Lisa added. The tool use we saw in the nesting chamber, these communication patterns, the teaching behavior, they're at least as smart as dolphins or elephants, maybe smarter. The team fell silent, letting the weight of their discovery sink in. The sounds of the creatures' communications continued to fill the room, a reminder of the amazing secret they had uncovered. What do we do now? Emily asked, looking at Thomas. Before he could answer, Marie's equipment started beeping again. We have a problem, she said, her voice tense. There's a boat approaching upriver. It's big, and it's not registered with any of the local authorities. Jack moved to check the security cameras they had set up. His face darkened. I know that boat, he said grimly. It belongs to Frank Davidson. He's a trophy hunter who specializes in rare and endangered species. Someone must have leaked information about our expedition. Thomas looked at his team's worried faces. Their amazing discovery was now in danger, and they had to act fast to protect these incredible creatures before it was too late. John walked slowly through the dark forest, his heart racing with fear. He knew something was out there, something dangerous that wanted to hurt him. The moonlight made strange shadows on the ground that looked like monsters reaching for him. He tried to be brave, but his hand shook as he held the flashlight. Snap! A loud noise came from behind a large tree. John froze, too scared to move or breathe. Silence followed for a minute that felt like forever. Gathering his courage, he took a few careful steps forward. His eyes strained to see what was hidden in the darkness ahead. Suddenly, a huge shape leaped out of the bushes. John cried out as a giant wolf landed in front of him, its yellow eyes glowing with hunger. Razor-sharp teeth snapped at John as he stumbled backwards, dropping the flashlight. The light rolled away, casting jumping shadows as the wolf circled John slowly. The wolf crept closer and closer, its growl rumbling deep in its throat. John looked around wildly, desperate to find a way to escape. He spotted a heavy fallen branch on the ground nearby. In one quick motion, he grabbed the branch and swung it as hard as he could at the wolf's head, yelling, "Get away!" The branch hit the wolf hard, making it yelp in pain and surprise. The wolf backed up a few steps, shaking its head. Then, with an angry snarl, it came at John again, faster this time. John barely managed to jump out of the way as the wolf's teeth chomped down right where he had been standing. John ran, his feet pounding on the uneven forest floor, his heart hammering with terror. He could hear the wolf right behind him, getting closer with every second. His mind raced, thinking of nothing but finding safety. In the distance, he saw an old wood cabin through the trees. With the last of his strength, he pushed himself to run faster, hoping to reach the cabin before the wolf reached him. When John was steps away from the cabin door, the wolf suddenly leaped, its powerful jaws opening to grab John's leg and pull him down. John screamed as he felt the sharp teeth start to sink into him. With a desperate last effort, he grabbed the door handle and yanked it open, throwing himself inside the cabin and slamming the heavy door shut just in time. The wolf crashed into the door with a loud thud. John backed away, shaking hard, as the wolf scratched and howled outside, trying to break in. The cabin walls shook, but held as the wolf attacked again and again in a frenzy. Finally, after many long minutes, the wolf gave up and went away, its howls fading into the night. John sank to the dusty cabin floor, his whole body aching with fear and exhaustion. He had escaped the wolf, but he was still lost in the deep, dark woods with no way to get home. He would have to wait until morning to figure out what to do next. Closing his eyes, he tried to rest, hoping the cabin would keep him safe until the sun rose again. But the terrifying night was far from over. John woke up as the first rays of morning light came through the dirty windows of the old cabin. His body was stiff and sore from sleeping on the hard floor. Slowly, he stood up and looked around. The inside of the cabin was a mess. It looked like no one had been there for a very long time. Dust and cobwebs covered everything. A few pieces of old broken furniture were scattered about. John's stomach growled with hunger. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. He searched the cabin for food but found nothing, not even a crumb. Thirst scratched at his throat too. Suddenly, he heard the sound of water dripping. He followed the sound to a rusty sink in the corner. When he turned the handle, wonder of wonders, water actually flowed out. The water looked dirty and smelled funny, but John was so thirsty he didn't care. He drank and drank until his stomach hurt. His thirst quenched for the moment. John then went to the cabin door and carefully pushed it open a crack. He peeked out, terrified that the wolf might still be nearby, waiting for him. But the clearing around the cabin was quiet and empty. Bright sunlight slanted through the trees. Birds sang in the distance. There was no sign of the wolf anywhere. Taking a deep breath, John stepped outside, blinking in the light. He looked at the cabin and realized it was actually quite small, more like a little hunter's shack than a real house. A short distance away stood an old outhouse that looked ready to fall over at any moment. Other than that, he saw nothing but trees in every direction. John picked a direction and started walking, hoping he was going the right way to find a road or a trail out of the forest. He walked for hours, stopping only to rest a few minutes at a time. The sun climbed high overhead and beat down through the trees. Sweat poured down John's face. His mouth felt as dry as cotton and his head ached. He was so hungry his stomach felt like it was tied in knots. Late in the afternoon, John suddenly heard a very welcome sound, the distant roar of a car engine. Filled with new energy, he started running toward the sound. The forest thinned out, and he spotted a paved road through the trees up ahead. A few minutes later, he burst out of the forest and onto the edge of the road, waving his arms and shouting for help. An old red pickup truck, going much too fast, zoomed around a curve and almost ran right into John before it screeched to a stop. A skinny, gray-haired man with a weathered face rolled down the window. "What in the heck are you doing, boy?" he yelled. "I almost flattened you." "Please, mister," John said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I've been lost in the woods since yesterday, chased by a wolf. I need help." The old man looked John up and down. He took in the torn, dirty clothes, the scratches on John's face and arms, the fear in his eyes. He sighed. "Well then, get in," he said, leaning over to push the passenger door open. "You look like you've been through the ringer and then some. We'll get you back to town. Climb in." Relief flooded through John. He hurried over and scrambled into the cab of the truck. "Gosh, mister, thank you," he said breathlessly as he closed the door. "I was starting to think I might never get out of those woods." The old man shook his head as he put the truck in gear and stepped on the gas. "Just sit back, boy," he said as they roared off down the road. "You're safe now." Or was he? John still didn't know who this old man was or where they were going. He had escaped the dark forest and the hungry wolf. But had he jumped out of the frying pan into the fire?